Think about what we're replacing. We're replacing a process of growing plant material or animals and extracting from that. It has a manufacturing cycle time of 2 years. Our process produces the same quantity of material in 2 weeks.
Hey, Rum, how's it going?
It's going. It's been another crazy week of events in the biotech space here in New York City. So again, bopping around. How about you? I know you've been really busy.
I wasn't satisfied with the number of biotech events in New York City. So I actually went to Boston for a biotech event as well. And as we record right now, it is Biotech Week in Boston, but it's Climate Week in New York City. So let's talk about some of the events we went to last week.
Yeah, absolutely. So last week was amazing because there were 2 biohacker focused events. One was hosted by DeSci NYC, which is organized by our friend Michael Fisher, who's a friend of the pod. And again, just in case you haven't heard about DeSci is decentralized science. How do we do science in a way that's decentralized, that's more democratic, where people can receive a token and thus value for participating in the science? So it's very fascinating to look at new ways of doing research and creating products. So this particular DeSci, the guest speaker was none other than Josie Zahner, who is an incredible scientist. She is the most well-known biohacker, most controversial biohacker on Netflix. The documentary Unnatural Selection features Josie Zahner, and it was cool. It was cool to see her perspective, and she did an incredible presentation, which was called Dreams of Biological Insanities. So it was, wow, there's things that she talked about, which were incredible and insightful and beautiful about biology, but also where creativity could go. It was bizarre, let's call it that. And there was things that she was showing in the presentation. She showed clips of a film by David Cronenberg, who, if anyone knows this film director, he's known for creating the body horror genre and has some freaky special effects going on. One you guys will have to Google is a ear guy. And so using biology to create ears all over your body so you can hear all over, not just from your head. Anyway, that was bizarre. But since Josie was in New York, she also attended and presented at another event, which was a really different tone. And it was called Vital Shift. And it was hosted by another friend of the pod, Shelby Nusad of Compound VC. And this event was held at Union Square Ventures. So a lot of venture capitalists and entrepreneurs attended. There's a variety of different speakers. So the first half of the event, which was an all-morning event, the first half of the event was really focused on traditional pharmaceutical, but pharmaceutical focused on longevity. And then the other half was focused on biohackers, people that are thinking on the edges of longevity and biology and how you can do biohacking. Josie's presentation for that event was a little bit more toned down, and that was called Building Better Life.
So I'm going to say a couple things before we go on. And number one is Cronenberg's been around for a really long time. And one of my favorite movies of his is Existence. His last movie, I can't remember what it's called, whatever the future one. That one's a little bit more extreme, but he does a lot of this body stuff and has been doing it since the 80s. And he's a real deep thinker when it comes to what people could be doing to their bodies.
Or using biology. I remember in Existence, the one where they have guns made of bone and
yeah, it's basically a virtual video game, not to spoil it. And that movie is at this point probably 15 or 20 years old. It's quite old. But Cronenberg also has a son who's done some of this same type of genre of movies. One in particular where people want to have the same illnesses that celebrities have. And so they pay for them on a black market. So I think it's really important for us to have people like Josie Zahner in the world. And on that same note, there is a fantastic animated series on Netflix called Scavenger's Reign, which is about a group of people that are stranded on an alien planet and the planet is filled with biology. Biology is totally alien, but it's just a reminder that biology has its own mission, which is survival and reproduction, and it doesn't care about humans. That's probably would be the same case on our planet. But I really enjoyed the compound event. I thought it was really eye-opening to see Josie speak and really interesting to see what some of the other people that were on the panel or presenting were talking about.
Yeah, there's a lot. My head was spinning first after the DSci event, and then 2 days later after this Vital Shift event at Compound and Union Square Ventures. I mean, I'm still processing it. And I think we would do our audience and you, our listener, a great service by speaking about it more in depth later, because there are not only ideas that are like, okay, ear guy, okay, that's kind of crazy, but also new ways of looking at the pharmaceutical industry, new ways of looking at supplements. So pharmaceuticals versus supplements, what does that look like? What do you need? And what are specific biomarkers to look at for growing yourself for longer? So a lot of this biohacker conversation is also in line with longevity conversations. It's very relatable. And what people are doing today on their own, circumventing the need for getting pharmaceutical drugs. So circumventing the need for getting pharmaceutical drugs or other very expensive, hard to access interventions. They're just taking it on their own accord to do what's needed and what's right. So stay tuned for that. We'll do a further deep dive into biohacking and longevity.
Yeah. And then the other thing that happened last week was we held our own climate bio event. We co-hosted a networking event with our friend of the pod, Alex Rose of Cascade Biosciences, Homeworld Collective, and then also friends of the pod, Synonym. So we came together, around 50 people showed up. We had a lot of food, a lot of beer, and it was a lot of fun. I left a little early because I had to take a bus to Boston. And then I went up to Boston for the DARPA event.
Yeah. It was a great event. We'll definitely have more climate bio events. It's a great way of getting our friends together, since some of our friends are in biopharma, others are in food, in fashion, in ag, and people on all sides of the biotech sphere are so interested in the other sides. So it's great when you participate in conversations. We're like, oh, you're doing that? Oh, that can relate to this. So that's wonderful. And you stayed long enough to make an appearance, address a crowd. Everyone was happy that you were there. And thanks for coming, because I know you had to wake up really early to go to Boston for an incredible event. Where did you go to and what happened there?
So DARPA, which is basically the people who invented the internet, their Defense Advanced Research Projects Authority, and they have held 2 events, one in San Francisco and one in Boston, where they bring together a group of people to talk about AI and biotech. What was amazing about the event was not only that there were a lot of people that we knew there, but just seeing the breadth of the things that DARPA is working on. And this spans from things like new materials, how do we grow reefs that will last longer, how do we remediate a spot that maybe the Army or the armed forces have gone into for a short period of time, how do you grow food on site, how do you care for the injured? Things like that were what they presented, but what they're really doing was almost like a listening tour. They wanted to invite people from the biotech community. The part of DARPA that presented this is their Biological Technologies Office. They presented the different program managers. There's probably a dozen of them. They each talked about their interests, and their idea is to get people to apply and to present projects to DARPA, projects that seemingly would be considered impossible because they want to focus on impossible projects, and get people to apply for a grant. We'll put the link in the show notes, but the grant deadline is very quick. And this is something that they're working on to just get more people involved. I was super impressed by it. One of the things that I walked away with that was just really, to me, something I've been thinking about, but I'm not sure anybody really articulated it, but was this idea of having different kinds of microbes working together for construction. And I think George Church of Harvard and MIT mentioned the use of biological 3D printers. And I think that's really one direction that we're going in. We do have people who are working on printing organs, but this idea of using different cells to produce something is fascinating to me. And I can't wait to get more people on the podcast to talk about it.
Well, we do have someone to talk a little bit about engineering cells to make molecules. And that's our guest today, Christina Smolke. How did you meet Christina, Karl? When's the first time you met her?
I had met Christina Smolke at the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference in 2020, so right before the pandemic. And I believe it was right as she was starting Antheia, the company that she's going to be speaking about. But what's interesting, and I think the transition from DARPA to Christina makes a lot of sense, because one of the things that the DARPA people were talking about was manufacturing on site, biomanufacturing on site, having medicines available for soldiers, and also having medicines available for space travel, which is something we've talked about previously on this podcast. So Christina Smolke is the CEO and founder of Antheia, and I think we should just let her describe what she's doing. Dr. Christine Smolke, we are so pleased to have you on the Grow Everything podcast today. I suspect you're joining us from somewhere in the Bay Area. You've got the beautiful Antheia background. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. And looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, you and I have met and had conversations a number of times over the years at Symbio Beta, at JP Morgan. And I'm going to just start. Your lab at Stanford made headlines because you guys engineered yeast to produce opioids. That got a ton of attention. And I feel like that was the genesis of Antheia. Tell us about engineering yeast to produce opioids. What was your motivation for doing that? What were some of the challenges you faced? And how did that turn into Antheia?
Yeah, no, great question. So the genesis of that work really came back to being able to push the frontiers of what is possible with biotechnology, especially biotechnology as a manufacturing platform for critical molecules. And maybe even taking a step back, if we think about the science, I am trained as a chemical engineer. My lab's at Stanford, and prior to that, even Caltech, I was training students and postdocs in really the cutting edge of chemical engineering. And what we arrived at in terms of a really strong need in the technology space was we, as the scientific area, have built out chemical synthesis to be this really powerful technology, where we use it, we rely on it to basically do bottom-up synthesis of molecules that are important for us. And it's transformed the world that we live in, but there are limitations. It ultimately relies on non-renewable feedstock, essentially, and uses relatively unsustainable process steps. And we can see that impacting basically the world globally. So it was taking a step back and saying, as engineers, we see what biology is capable of in terms of its ability to perform synthesis. The challenge has always been it's not harnessable for us as humans. We're reliant on taking what we get, but we really don't have a complementary way to program biology in a bottom-up synthesis route. That was really the genesis of what we were doing in my labs from an academic perspective. Now, how did we arrive at opiates as the test case for that? It was really about, number one, how do we pick a problem that can push the science, but that also has impact, so that if we are successful, it can really lead to something that will have significant impact on industry, but also on human health and planetary health. So that then led us to think about, again, okay, what is important for human health and planetary health? Actually, pharmaceutical ingredients, how we make our medicines, how we make them, but also how we make them accessible to people was one of the key factors there. And also because it advanced the science. So again, when you think about a lot of the critical medicines that we rely on, their synthesis is actually very complicated. They are very complex molecules. They can take anywhere of 30 to 50 synthesis steps. That is something that chemical synthesis actually cannot deliver on right now, which is why when you look at, for example, medicinal opiates, medicinal painkillers, or even addiction treatment medicines, we don't make them by chemical synthesis. We are extracting these compounds from plants in the same way that we have done for hundreds of years, because chemical synthesis can't make them in efficient ways at scale. We wanted to basically pick problem cases where biology could really shine. And it's not trying to compete with really efficient chemical synthesis processes right now, but let's look at where chemical synthesis falters. Let's look at where there's a really big need in terms of human health and in particular accessibility to really critical medicines. And then let's really push the science and say, why can't we do better than extracting from an animal or plant? What has to happen from the scientific and technology perspective so that we can do better? And let's use that as the problem that we actually then work to build a technology solution around. That was what really motivated that work at Stanford prior to Caltech. And so what was the technology challenge? It was basically, how do you take a microorganism like yeast, something that can grow really inexpensively and really quickly on a feedstock like sugar, and convert that to, well, we're used to using it to convert it to ethanol in beer and wine, but also organic acid. But how can we basically reprogram the yeast so that it will go through that same process, but convert sugar to this really important critical medicine and do so in a way that leads to greater efficiency, better cost savings, better control? The technical challenge then was, okay, now to get yeast to make this compound, you have to program it and bring in 30 or more different enzymatic process steps because it's very different from what yeast would ordinarily make. That was a transformative challenge in the space because up to that point, basically the state of the art was we can maybe bring 3 to 5 enzymes into a bacteria or a yeast strain to make this molecule that looks very similar to what yeast would already make. And that was the state of the art of metabolic engineering and synthetic biology. So to be able to take it from 5 enzymes to 30 or 40, that was really a step change. That was really what drove the work. And again, it was around if we can make that step change, then we can really enable a bottom-up synthesis approach that's complementary to synthetic chemistry, but one that leverages the power of biology. And really, ultimately, from that perspective, when you look at it, it's getting away from non-renewable feedstock, non-renewable resources, and giving us a much more sustainable way of producing these compounds, not relying on really harsh solvents and creating a lot of pollution and waste as a byproduct, but giving us that sustainable way that nature basically performs its chemistry. So that was really the motivation of that work. Why did we choose opiates? It was because of their really critical role in the healthcare system. One, they are essential medicines. Palliative care and pain management is actually really important for humane care. And it's one where if you look globally, organizations like the World Health Organization have highlighted that the vast majority of the population actually does not have sufficient access to these types of medicines. Of course, it's a reverse problem in the US, but it's one if you think globally where access is really actually important and having a way to produce it in a more controlled way, in a more transparent way, could actually give solutions to both problems. But it was really then melding the two, impact on human health, critical role in the healthcare system, driving transformative advances in the science.
Christina, thank you so much for that. I mean, I've been so excited to speak with you because there are just so many wins with your process and your approach to pharmaceutical manufacturing. And here at Messaging Lab, yes, we do communications, but we also look at the business strategies. So I have a lot of business related questions for you. But for now, you mentioned the limitations or the inaccessibility in different parts of the world for some of these drugs, right? There's been global drug shortages. It's been common. And what I want to know more from your perspective is there are plenty of challenges that current pharmaceutical manufacturers face. There's limitations in their infrastructure. But can you talk about some of those current hurdles with building US's pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity to meet some of these global drug shortages?
Yeah, absolutely. You started with the global drug shortages. So how did we get here? Why is this happening? Essentially, we went through a period of time where the pharmaceutical supply chain basically evolved globally. And it evolved globally in the way that many of our supply chains have evolved, but essentially to optimize on costs, to optimize on volumes and capacity. All those things go together. And so what you ultimately saw is the way that it evolved is that you have very strong geographical concentration of where manufacturing of our pharmaceutical ingredients takes place. And most of it is not occurring in countries like the US. So over 80% of our pharmaceutical ingredients are not produced in the US. And then we primarily rely on 2 different countries, basically India and China, for a lot of the production. At some point, that seemed okay. Again, it was for optimizing cost and volumes. But now we're running into challenges with the way that it's evolved. What it means ultimately is that there is a lot of single source failures, basically, in our supply chains because with the conventional technology and having to optimize for volumes, you might have maybe 1 or 2 producers that really have built up scale to make 1 or 2 products. But if that facility goes down for whatever reason, whether it's basically related to a regulatory issue, right, at a quality issue, which can happen if it's related to weather or even a pandemic, when you have these places go down, that means that the sole supplier has gone out for making this drug and you don't have capacity that can bring it up very quickly. So that's one of the big challenges. The other challenge, of course, especially with the ingredients that we focus on, is that you are reliant on agricultural sourcing, which has very high latency, very strong unpredictability from season to season. And it's only getting worse as we see weather patterns change and other kind of events disrupt these types of supply chains. So with these 2 things coming together, Again, what we see is that we are experiencing an increased frequency and duration of drug shortages. And it's a really critical medicines. People are surprised that we have shortages on, whether it's cold medicines, which we experienced in the last winter, to ADHD medicines, to chemotherapeutics. It's affecting a broad swath of this. That's how we got here. Now, the question is, how do we provide solutions? We're really strongly on the camp of we need to be able to leverage advanced manufacturing technology to be able to provide resiliency and better ways of manufacturing for these critical ingredients. So not trying to move conventional approaches back to the US, right, or back to particular regions and saying, we're just going to build more factories that leverage conventional technology because there are limitations there. And that's certainly why it moved offshore to begin with. But if we look at biotechnology, there's a lot of advantages that biotechnology can provide, why we should be making those types of investments. First and foremost, we talked a bit about how it really transforms robustness and allows for a more on-demand and agile process. So think about what we're replacing. We're replacing a process of growing plant material or animals and extracting from that. It has a manufacturing cycle time of 2 years. Our process produces the same quantity of material in 2 weeks. The fermentation process itself takes 4 days. And we've done it, we're operating it, and take sizes that are hundreds of thousands of liters robustly. So that's hugely transformative. But the other, I think, critical thing about biotechnology in terms of offering solutions is that it's a much more agile and repurposable technology when it comes to infrastructure. So again, I think part of the challenge with conventional technology is that you have things that are very purpose-built. So you have a facility that's making a chemotherapeutic. You can't actually just switch that facility to make a cold medicine or to make an addiction treatment medicine. They're very purpose-built in terms of the unit operation. You can make 1 or 2 things there, and that's that. Fermentation is completely different because the fermentation vessel is very repurposable. And what changes is the microorganism that you put in there. So you can imagine having just a whole cell bank of different strains of yeast that are engineered to produce different medicines. Could be a chemotherapeutic, could be a pain medicine, could be an addiction treatment medicine. And you can go from making one to the other in that same facility in basically 1 day. All you have to do is just go through, clean out the fermenter, and you put the new yeast strain in. That repurposability is huge in terms of how we think about infrastructure investment and solving this problem in the US. Because we don't have to make particular bets and say, all right, we're going to invest $100 million in a facility that's purpose-built for this chemotherapeutic. But there's only so much finite amount of capital. We can really invest in building a state-of-the-art biomanufacturing facility. We now have capability internally, and the US is really a leader in this too, in terms of developing the assets, the different microbial drug factories that are producing different drug ingredients. And you can have a facility that can make tens to hundreds of different products on the flip of a dime, basically, or within a period of 1 day. Again, I just think it's really important to understand that because it's a much smarter way for us to think about how we invest and reinvigorate the infrastructure in the US to solve a few different things. One, of course, is you grow the bioeconomy, you grow the US's leadership in biotechnology, but you also then solve this issue of how do we bring back resiliency in our critical supply chains, pharmaceutical ingredients being one of this. How do we continue to bring that resiliency, transparency, and control? And it can do all of that in a much more efficient way.
I think what you said about drug shortages is something most people don't know about. At any given time, 200 drugs that are in shortage. And they can be anything from lidocaine to the things that are used to knock you out in surgery. This became something that was being critically looked at during the last administration. I'd been working on drug shortages maybe 10 years ago, but it really became acute because the supply chain, as you said, really became dependent on India and China. And a lot of times what would happen is that you'd have supply chain issues around quality. I'm under the impression that the opioid supply chain really depends on one place in the world. Poppies are grown not in Afghanistan, where they're grown for illicit purposes, but I think in Tasmania. And so when I think about what you guys do and what you just said is you basically could build a facility, you can containerize it, which Moderna did during the pandemic, to be able to produce vaccines in places that didn't have vaccine factories. So talk to us about the pipeline. What are you guys producing? And is what I just said right, or am I totally wrong?
No, I mean, so what you said is generally correct.
Generally.
Generally. I mean, I will make one correction. which is to say, you were right that Tasmania is one of the primary sources of medicinal opiates with its poppy farming. But there is probably about 4 other regions of the world which do supply this material as well. Hungary, Turkey, Spain and France basically are some of the regions, especially when we look at global supply of medicinal opiates. But it comes back to the point that it is geographically concentrated, and actually different regions will focus on different products because it's not just one product that this plant is producing. So there's some specialization there as well. But you're absolutely correct. When you think about then going to fermentation, it completely opens up in terms of where you produce, because now you don't have to think about soil quality, you don't have to think about weather, all these different things, which is currently now what restricts where these crops get grown. You can much more think about where does it make sense to supply a particular region. And that comes back again to the point that I made in the beginning around organizations like the World Health Organization putting out regular reports where it talks about accessibility to pain medicines, right? Because it is something where there's such a disparate accessibility issue across the world. And it's considered of very high importance that the entire world has some form of access to palliative care, because it is so critical when you look at things like cancer treatment and different types of humane treatment for different types of, whether it's surgery, whether it's chemotherapeutics, et cetera.
Hi, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Messaging Lab, the force multiplier for biotech. Your biotech company is making the world a better place. You know that, we know that. But does the world? There's a big reason why some biotech companies attract investors, sign up customers, and get attention. That reason is strategic communications. At Messaging Lab, we translate complex science and economics into compelling narratives. And we have done that for the most successful biotech companies across healthcare, agriculture, personal care and beauty, materials, and the list goes on. We're here to make sure your ideas not only get heard, but resonate with your audience. So if it's time to amplify your company's voice, visit messaginglab.com to explore how we can elevate your story and grow your business.
And now you switch to talk a little bit about Antheia's pipeline, because one of the key points I think for me was one of the primary goals of developing this as a platform technology is that the problem is much bigger than one particular class of medications. As you said, health shortages and drugs is hitting every area. And the other thing that people don't realize beyond just drug shortages is that there's a very significant fraction of our medicines today that we rely on that do rely on agricultural sourcing. These two things combined mean as Antheia builds out its pipeline, our intent and what we're executing on is really to apply this to many of our most essential and critical medications, and especially ones for which, again, there is variability in the supply chains, and that this is continuing to get worse as we look at how global dynamics are continuing to evolve. So for our pipeline, we span a variety of different areas. This includes areas of pain management, addiction treatment, rescue medications. It also includes sedatives, and then going into areas of oncology, anti-infectives as well. So there's 7 broad categories of medications that we are focused on right now. And it really does span a very diverse swath. But again, the primary sort of thing that we look at when we develop our pipeline is, first and foremost, what are medications that play a really critical role in public health and global health. And for that, we will look at, okay, what medications are on the World Health Organization Essential Medicine list? What medications are on the FDA Essential Medicine list? We try to triangulate across different essential medicine lists that different organizations have produced. And then we'll look at what are the challenges in the existing supply chain. Are these drugs under shortage? How long have they been under shortage? How much is the supply chain and the way that it's being produced? But again, what is Antheia's technology going to bring in terms of advantages for sourcing?
Can you talk to us a little bit more about how Antheia fits into the pharmaceutical industry? Are your customers big pharma and they're looking for new ways to supplement their drug supply?
Absolutely. We fit in different ways, but let's focus on the start with what we've talked about today, which is when we apply our technology platform to develop a disruptive manufacturing process for a drug ingredient. This pipeline that I talked about, these are already approved drugs. So they're not innovative drugs where they still have to go through clinical trials and grow the market. These are drugs that have existed on the market for long periods of time. Ultimately, the molecules themselves are generics. And so there are multiple pharma companies that use these molecules to formulate drug products. We are a drug ingredient supplier in this case, which means we develop the technology. In many cases, and with our first products, we are manufacturing the ingredient and then we are selling the ingredient to our customers, which are pharma companies, right? But pharma companies will basically take that ingredient. It will ultimately get formulated into a drug product and then make its way to the patients. In this way that the industry is organized, they're already and currently purchasing ingredient from different vendors, which they use to produce their products. And we become an alternative vendor for them for sourcing this ingredient. And again, why would they make the switch? It's really around surety of supply. They understand and they have experienced the challenges with sourcing from agricultural suppliers and vendors and having to worry about disruption in a crop or failure of a crop from year to year. The surety of supply is a big thing for them. They understand the technology and the advances, the advantages that this brings in terms of surety of supply, time, and then cost, as well as sustainability. That final thing is something that you see more and more. Of course, it's been more prevalent outside of pharma, but now even within pharma, sustainability and being able to get to more sustainable metrics with their manufacturing processes is something that is becoming increasingly important depending on the region.
Now, earlier you had said that you guys have scaled to be able to produce, you said hundreds, I don't know if you said tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of liters, but really a significant amount. And we know that other companies have struggled in synthetic biology to scale up production. What is it that you guys are doing differently to be able to go to those quantities?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So first and foremost, we have scaled our processes to 120,000 liters with our manufacturing partner and demonstrated that the process is robust and it's consistent and no attrition in performance from how it behaves at 1 liter in the lab. Certainly, I think most people who understand the synthetic biology industry would agree that's a really wonderful milestone to show that. And many companies have stumbled on that scale up process. So coming back to your question then, how is Antheia different? I would say one thing about Antheia, I think probably comes back to just how we started and then the founders. I think it's focus and being really laser focused on delivering what we say we're going to deliver and ensuring that we allow our team to be focused on that particular problem. And I say this in the context of what I've seen with the industry is that there's so much potential of the technology and there's so much that it can be used for. I think a lot of times what we've seen is that we've even experienced it internally is people want to pull you in different directions of, okay, this is great, but you could be doing this. And why aren't you doing this? And we have this really great idea for a partnership and you should be doing that. But all of that takes bandwidth and diverts attention away from what your primary goal would be. And so again, I think what I would say in terms of what I attribute our success to is Antheia's ability to remain laser focused on the goals that we set out for and making sure that we don't dilute our efforts too early on, because there is so many exciting things that we can do with this technology. We get confronted with it every day. And it's like, okay, yes, all these things are really exciting, but we need to make sure we deliver on this piece of it. And we need to make sure that we're allowing our team to stay focused on it and not pulling them off in too many different directions. So I think that's the key piece that I would say. And then the only second thing I would just say is really having a team that has the experience and has seen where things stumble and really setting their objectives to say, let's be really realistic about what we think is possible. Let's understand where things have stumbled and failed in the past. And let's make sure that we're anticipating that and really trying to catch things before we just go off to scale. But let's really try to bring in all of the learnings that we have collected together as an industry to bring that in and really try to anticipate it and catch it before it gets too far.
Yeah, that clearly is a winning strategy. The focus is really important. But so no skunk works happening on the side. No 80-20, do you have like 20% going into something unique? No.
I think that there's always, I would say that there's always some level of, I'm not going to say that there's no skunk works and there's no kind of, how do we think about Antheia in 5 or 10 years? Absolutely. We have those conversations. We have certain people on the team who are thinking about that. I think the industry has to be careful, but also as a company, what I can say for myself as a company and someone who's trying to steer this company to basically deliver on what we say we're going to deliver and also be judicious with how we use our funds. It's just as a startup, you have a limited time frame to basically hit certain value points and demonstrate that you can deliver. And you have some advice from advisors and mentors generally around company building. You need to make sure you define exactly what you're going to be held accountable for. And it should not be a huge list, right? Like, you need to have a very small list of things these are the critical things to deliver on. And then you need to make sure that you've organized your team around being able to deliver on that. Everything else, nice to haves, but don't make those nice to haves cannot endanger the need to have. And if that means that you're going to tell people, no, we don't have the money to start this, or no, we're not going to accept this partnership because it's going to pull too many resources in a way that does not make sense for us to achieve this, then you have to do that. And you may not be popular for some people. And certainly what we're seeing today, it goes in waves. Sometimes there's a certain mentality of, yes, we want to fund companies that are saying they can do everything. And we've seen that doesn't necessarily lead to success. What we've tried to stay the course on in Antheia is that it's really important to get these first critical proof points out and show and really validate the technology, validate that for your first couple test cases to show that you can check those boxes and answer that question. Because I think that's where we get distracted a lot. The science is wonderful and the science we can do a lot of things with, but we need to make sure that these other layers are there. We need to make sure that we've delivered, we've set that up. Then once you have that core, you can begin to diversify that more, but you don't want to do that necessarily. I don't think you want to do that too early because you really have a certain set of time and trajectory to really demonstrate the de-risking, not just of the science, but of the scale up of the operations, but also of the commercial, right? And that really does require a lot of focus.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about drug shortages being a national security issue. And earlier this year, you had Secretary of State Anthony Blinken visit you guys for a discussion about the importance of biotech innovation in the United States. That's something we talk a lot about with our audience. At the same time, you guys were awarded a government grant that supported the onshoring of pharmaceutical ingredient production. Can you maybe discuss what those government initiatives signal for you and also for the broader biotech, biopharma, synbio industries?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think signals is that the government is aware, the government is listening, the government is looking at ways to support this critical technology. We've seen this in stages. You even talked a little bit about conversations and discussions you're having in the prior administration. We see this in this administration. Most notably, we had the executive order on the bioeconomy. We've had executive orders on critical supply chains, pharmaceutical ingredients being one of those. I think all of these come together to a narrative, which is really to say, first and foremost, biotechnology, synthetic biology, bioengineering, whatever you want to refer to it, it is critical in terms of rebuilding and, first of all, addressing challenges we face with our critical supply chains, but even much more so in terms of biosurveillance, all these things. The U.S. needs to be a leader. Specific to Antheia, the focus discussion is really on critical supply chains. And so when you see these different things come together, when you look at the Biomap Consortium and the contract agreement was awarded through that, there's a lot of work and education that went into that, right? But ultimately, that's a recognition by the government that this is a technology that we believe is actually ready now to provide solutions at scale for the U.S. population. We are now making strategic investments to ensure that be successful and really address challenges we're seeing in pharmaceutical ingredient supply chains and leveraging biomanufacturing as a solution. So I think that's a critical step. When you look at the Secretary of State, and I think there it's really around a narrative and a discussion about what does the U.S. need to do to ensure that it continues to lead in this space. And I think specifically there, the conversation is also around not just what the U.S. does internally, but we have to also recognize that this is a global network of nations. And we have to look at how we coordinate not just within the U.S., but with friend nations and partner nations to really ensure, again, that biotechnology can be used to ensure a flourishing society and that the technology itself is used and made available in a way that's going to benefit the entire global population. So when we talk about things that are relevant directly to human health and things where we're seeing very clear breakdowns and just a disparity in terms of access, I think those conversations really are very important. How do we set up the appropriate partnerships and collaborate on a global scale to ensure that we can leverage this technology to provide solutions that are going to impact everybody in a positive way? And the U.S. should be a leader in that. To me, that's those two things build upon each other in a broader narrative that we are seeing build out in Washington, D.C. This may be one area where there is very strong bipartisan support on the U.S. First of all, needs to do more to bring this resiliency to critical supply chains, pharmaceutical ingredients being one of those. And the U.S. government should have a role in ensuring and incentivizing that in various ways, but ultimately ensure that the innovation and the leadership that's being shown on the technology and science side is something that goes to create meaningful solutions and allow for the U.S. to continue its leadership.
That's incredible. As we're talking about Antheia, there's so many wins, as I mentioned. Sustainable manufacturing, it's faster, it's more secure, and that's really exciting. But when are we leapfrogging this method of pharmaceutical manufacturing? And how is Antheia promoting this to the pharmaceutical industry? When are we going to just completely transform? Because it sounds like plant extraction, that's not the most sustainable method. And of course, takes a long time. When are we going to do the flip? And I know it's something you think about all the time, but please share.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. One of the aspects of leapfrogging, the way that we view it or we discuss it internally, part of that is really coordinating, partnering with the infrastructure investments that need to happen to allow this to scale in particular areas. One of the things you alluded to questions was infrastructure and infrastructure to support biomanufacturing. This is something that the US actually is behind on. So, for example, in Antheia's case, where we are manufacturing now is actually in Europe. We're not manufacturing in the US because we could not find the infrastructure available for us to do this with a manufacturing partner in the US. And there's just more available facilities for us to partner with in Europe. That's a limitation. And we're hoping to address that over time with the partnerships that we have through the Biomap Consortium and some of the other partnerships that we're building. But in terms of leapfrogging, that's actually one of the key barriers that I see right now, when I think about this, because in Antheia, our processes are ready to scale. We have scaled them. And we're actually now making product for customers for commercial. But if we don't have the infrastructure, that limits where we can scale. And so that comes into conversations, at least in the US, that we can directly have, which is, okay, how do we address this problem? Is it investing in facilities that are going to set up conventional manufacturing approaches for these drug ingredients? And we talked about the limitations there in terms of not agile, a lot of investment for one or two drugs. How do you make that? How do you make those kind of bets versus saying, no, we're actually going to take a strategy here of leveraging advanced manufacturing, setting up state-of-the-art facilities and really leveraging kind of the innovation that's being driven through our scientists and leaders and using that to rebuild these supply chains. So one, I think leapfrogging is enabled by those types of strategic infrastructure investments. Two, I think the other thing of that is then how does the industry come along? Because typically pharma is conservative industry. And I would agree with that. But I think what you're seeing is that actually pharma is where a lot of innovation has been welcome. And the regulation within pharma, while some people view that as a hurdle, I think it actually can be a feature because it sets up very clearly what the requirements are. And because it's standardized, it means that everybody in the industry follows it. An example that is within Antheia's process, we have to go through different regulatory approvals, right? But there are very streamlined ways to do that. And the standards that we have to meet to basically be comparable to the existing product are very well defined. So it's not like if I supply to customer A, because there's no regulations, they have a different spec than customer B. So for every different customer, I have different specs that I have to try to basically fulfill to get them to buy my material. That's not how it is. There's a consistent spec that everybody uses. If we can meet that, single product can be purchased by companies all over the world. So that's what I mean to say that a lot of times we think that pharma is slow moving and the regulatory presents hurdles. I actually think it's a feature that we can use because it means that there's one standard that's held and we can fulfill everybody's standards if we can meet that. The second thing I would just say is that when you work within that framework, it provides the guidelines by how you do these types of changes. And we have seen pharma basically welcome innovation. Again, all you have to do is go back to the example of biosynthetic insulin, where you used to basically extract insulin from pigs and cows. That was how it was done. Where again, it wasn't a cost was certainly one thing, but it was also just predictability, resilience, and having a much more consistent process, one that can scale easily. It's all of that rolled into the industry, making a pretty quick pivot once that new technology was enabled. I think we have to keep all of this in mind. And within that context, I would say you have to keep in mind the framework of regulatory when you're bringing this type of innovation to the industry of pharma. But the argument that we see is that can actually be a benefit in terms of providing the guidelines of what you need to meet. And then you're working with an industry and partners and customers that understand the technology, have seen these types of transitions before. And if there's clear value add that's being added in the supply chain, they have shown that they can welcome it.
It's interesting to me to hear you talk about biomanufacturing from the Antheia point of view and the fact that you guys had to go to Europe for your first products, because it does seem like there is a lot of new manufacturing capacity coming on board. And big pharma has been buying up capacity. And yet, on the other hand, we hear this push-pull from the SynBio side that there's not enough capacity. Yes, there is. There's just not enough products. When will you guys have product that is being produced here in the United States? And how do you think the pharma supply chain will change over the next decade based on a technology like what you guys are developing?
Yeah, absolutely right. There's a lot of push-pull. There's also a lot of evolution in that because the government is starting to make some targeted investments in expanding capacity. One thing I would just highlight within the broader synthetic biology conversation is not all capacity is for any purpose. So for us, we need relatively large tanks, so 100,000 liter plus tank sizes, but we need to be able to operate in a relatively controlled environment. So there needs to be certain controls in place so that you can make it CGMP or follow CGMP guidelines, which is different than if you're making a commodity chemical that doesn't go through those same regulations. So it's just to say there can be different layers in terms of the facility and capacity that is available and that's coming online. We have been working very hard to basically get our US-based supply chain set up. Our plans are to be able to have production in the US by early 2026 in terms of material coming out of our partners' facilities. So again, really our goal is to be able to leverage biomanufacturing to be a broader solution to ensure that drug shortages decrease. So as you said, the numbers are really startling when you look at the number of drugs that are on active drug shortage. And it's something like 25% of the most active prescription, the 200 plus molecules that are on shortage. And it's really alarming. So number one, our mission and hope would be that as you bring this online and as you really start to switch over the supply chains to have this greater agility, transparency, and traceability, our hope would be that number should go down. Because part of it is just the clunkiness and the single source failures that I talked about. The other part is just the lack of transparency, the lack of traceability. Because of how oblique some of these supply chains get, it's actually what the FDA and others saw when they looked at this is they didn't know where some of these ingredients came from. And it's very hard to trace. And so then it's very hard to even track or anticipate when you're going to have a shortage. Anyway, so I think that's really critical. Being able to bring the capacity online where you have traceability, where you have control, and then how will it affect the industry? I would hope that it moves it to be one that's more nimble, where again, because of the long timelines, because of the risks associated, what you see right now is planning and contracting can oftentimes be done several years right ahead of when you're actually going to get the material in hand. If you have something that's much more agile, much more on demand, you can then be planning more directly based upon what the demand is that you're seeing. That's the other thing is that when we are trying to predict 2 years prior to actually getting material, a lot of things can happen. Yeah, I mean, we had a pandemic that happened. You have spikes in demand for particular drugs to treat patients in the hospitals, and you go into shortages. So it's again, if you can move to something that's more agile, where you have this capacity that can be repurposed, redirected if you have emergencies or if you have shortages, that gives the ability of the industry to be more agile. I think with other things that we're seeing, Antheia really focuses earlier in the supply chain on that manufacturing to the drug product formulator. There's work being done by others on the drug product formulator to customer to try to make those more efficient. And I think if we can do more to begin to marry those and bring those together, you could really begin to rebuild the industry in a way that allows agility, especially where we need it.
That's incredible. Yeah, it does need to be rebuilt. I mean, the fact that we can't trace some of these drugs now, but with Antheia, we can. I think that, again, it just adds to the list of wins that Antheia is bringing to the table. So very, very exciting. And I think we could talk to you for another hour or so, but we don't have that time, unfortunately. But you did give some advice, but maybe more just to round it out. Can you share some advice that you'd give other founders in the biotech and the SynBio space in particular?
Yeah, I would reiterate some of what I said before, but first and foremost, I think it's important to give yourself the space and the support around yourself to be able to focus, to be able to say, these are things we can't do right now, and really identify for yourself again, what are the top, 3 things that you need to deliver on in any given year, right, or any given cycle, and make sure that those are the things that you prioritize the most. There's always going to be so many things that pull and distract and could be really wonderful and exciting opportunities, but it's just being really realistic about people's bandwidths and what you can deliver on and what the priorities are, and making sure that everybody on the team and yourself are aligned with that and working together to achieve them. I think the second thing I would just say on top of that is clarity around that and transparency in terms of communication, both with your immediate team and then the broader team. I think all of that is really important, because if people don't understand what the priorities are, don't understand where they should be focused, what is mission critical for the company, et cetera, then I think that's also where things get distracted. So transparency and also just frankness, or being true to what is possible and why certain things might not be possible within a time frame. So those to me would be the key things that I would say. Just try to make sure you keep front of mind as you're making decisions, as you're building your own team, your own mission, and then delivering on it.
Amazing. Well, Christine, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us and the Grow Everything audience today. We really appreciate it. I think we need to have you come back and tell us about your progress in 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, I would love to do that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Karl, what'd you think about that interview?
Christina Smolke is amazing. At the beginning of the episode, I mentioned that I'd met her at JP Morgan in 2020, but I already knew about her because she'd published a paper in Nature where she described the manufacturing of opioids using yeast. And pain medications are something that are in shortage all over the world. There's not enough pain medications, and opioids in particular are a little bit challenging. I think there's only a few places in the world where they grow poppy seeds and harvest them legally for drugs. So when I first heard that they were engineering yeast to produce opioid precursors, I was super interested because I envisioned this world where you could manufacture those things on site at different places in the world, especially as people need them. And this fits into our theme of distributed biomanufacturing, which is something that we've been really exploring over the course of the past year. So to me, hearing Christina describe what Antheia is doing and the progress that they've made and being able to go from lab to 100,000 liters of manufactured product is amazing. What did you think, Erum?
Yeah, my sentiments exactly. There's just so many wins, as I mentioned in the episode. The fact that it takes sometimes up to 2 years to make an active pharmaceutical ingredient, but through fermentation and Antheia's process, it could be up to 2 weeks. I mean, that's just so mind-boggling. And then, of course, not reliant on certain manufacturers in different countries that are so far away. But again, to be able to have this capability to make pharmaceutical drugs anywhere, really, it's so phenomenal to see that. Again, one other disruption point for the pharmaceutical industry as it was. I really hope that big pharma and mid pharma are taking a good look at what Antheia is doing, creating the deals with Christina Smolke and her team and perhaps others. It's just amazing to see that, great, this is going to be something that is really going to change the game, not only for the active pharmaceutical ingredients, but something that we talked to her offline about is new molecules. We were talking earlier at the top of the episode in the intro about biology just being its own intelligence. And there's so much information that lives in biology to be able to engineer or even discover microbes that have unique therapeutic properties. I mean, that is how we have been using medicines before we really had this pharma industrial complex, was that we looked to using mostly plants, maybe some animals, maybe some microbes or molds, maybe some fungi to cure things that ail us. So to be able to think like, okay, now we have this huge palette of engineering biology and looking at different types of microbes to make unique therapeutics is incredible. It's so exciting to live in the time where this is a feasible thing and it's scaling up. So Christina and her team, they're working really hard, 120 kiloliters of product in an industry where that is probably one of the top scaled efforts, obviously beyond beer and typical fermentation processes. But it was great to hear not only what they're doing at Antheia, but how they're scaling up synthetic biology.
I think I talked about it when we were talking to her, but I just want to make it clear that people understand that drug shortages are a very real thing. You wouldn't think about a drug shortage unless you're affected by it. Hospitals have these problems. It's something that we at Messaging Lab have worked on in the past, helping a company like Civicar RX understand and tell people what they were doing to stop the drug shortage problem. But it cuts across all drugs, chemotherapy, CNS, antimicrobials, some of the most basic things like lidocaine, hormone agents, intravenous fluids. If you went into a hospital and they didn't have these things, you would be in terrible condition. And there's multiple reasons for this, but a lot of it is the fact that generics are not a profitable industry to be in. So people are always looking for the lowest cost providers. And in many cases, those providers are overseas. So having Antheia be available and localizing production and making these products available and hopefully helping to solve the shortage problem is a really big deal. So I'm super happy for Antheia's continued progress, and I'm looking forward to seeing them win.
It's going to be great to keep track of Christina Smolke, her team, and what Antheia is working on, how they're scaling up. We can learn lessons from them as we look to make other products using different types of microbes and fermentation and cell-free. Got to throw that in there for our friend Alex Rose. So stay tuned, because this is what we talk about here at Grow Everything, how we can not only grow everything that we use on the daily basis, but also ourselves. How can we continue to grow as humans and live a longer life? We welcome you to be a part of our community. We have a Patreon community. A lot of our friends are a part of it. It's a great way to stay in touch with us. Please reach out. And if you have any questions, we have our Grow Everything hotline. We have ways to get in touch with us on social media or email. We would love to hear from you. So please get in touch. Thank you so much. I think with that, that's the pod. Is there anything else you want to say, Karl, before we head out?
That's the pod.